to put ourselves in the best position possible to get approved. The approvals come in late May and very early June, so it's a long process, a couple more months, so we'll know. But we'll also sort of tell you some things that you can do to kind of push the needle as well.
The 11, like, pre-approved, 4 approved.
That's a great question. So the PCSB is at liberty to accept or approve as many as they would like. Oftentimes there's 1 or 2 approvals. Last year there were, I believe, 4 or 5 applicants, and there were 0 approvals last year. So it depends on the year. Some of those who were declined last year are back for a second attempt. Some of you might know Lee actually was approved on its second attempt. And so there's a lot of different factors, sort of practical and also political. And there's reason to believe that, well, there were 0 approved last year. Some of you might be aware there are some schools that are unfortunately being closed by the PCSB this year due to performance. And so that there's some implications that creates some space for some approvals. So that's kind of the good side of that, but we'll see. So they could approve 4 or 5, or they theoretically could say try again.
Is there a cap on the number of schools, or is there like so do they try to create some sort of like a balance between elementary, middle, high school? You know, you don't want to have like all high schools, but no.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you're kind of implying a little bit of strategy, and I think they do think about that sort of thing. Right now, and Sarah and Denise should correct me if I'm a little bit off with this percentage, DC is one of the rare cities where the charter sector is just about as big as the DC public school sector. And so I think more than 45% of students public students in DC are in the charter sector. And then a little over 50 are in DC public schools. And so on the one hand, I think the PCSB would love to jump at the chance to like increase charter seats and availability for when they think they can fill them. And especially when they think they can fill it with quality and like a rigorous program. But I'm sure they also are reluctant to approve too many and then create a ton of seats and then have a lot of schools that are under enrolled. So I think they're probably seeking a balance.
Are those 11 all middle high or all?
That's another great question. I think at least 2 of them are just high schools. I know at least 2 of them are just middle schools. And then there are, I think, 3 or 4 just elementary schools, maybe 5 even elementary schools, and then there's 1 K through 12.
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
And just maybe it's just my unfamiliarity with the process. So I know the DC lottery is like January. You find out in March, but you don't find out from the board until May if your charter's approved.
Yep.
When is the year? When would this first school year
The
start?
timeline question is a great one. So there's going to be, and I'll probably try to mention this like 10 times today, there's going to be a public hearing on April 22nd, right over, it's probably going to be at Trinity, which some of you know is kind of right across the street. I don't think they've announced the location yet, but I have a feeling it'll be at Trinity. We're going to have childcare here. For those of you that, if that's kind of a burden and you would love to be able to drop off your student or students and then head over there for an hour or so. They don't make the decision then. They ask questions. There's an opportunity for a handful of us will make public comments. And when I say us, parents can be included in that. And then in May, they have a follow-up meeting that will be on May 20th. It might even be here at Lee, I think. Chris, is it actually going to be at Lee?
I'm operating a date. I'm not sure if
Yeah, so they reached out. They're looking for a location for this May 20th meeting. That's the meeting where the board members make their decisions. So there's 7 members of the Public Charter School Board in DC, and if you get 4 positives, then you get approved. Then they send an official letter in early June, but we will know May 20th, the evening of May 20th, whether we are approved. And then to really get at the root of your question, that then creates a planning year. So next year becomes an official planning year. But at a funded planning year, there's federal startup grants and things that are then released, which allows us to have a more robust, paid planning team that can be full-time during that planning year to then be able to hit the ground running with students in the summer of 2020.
Okay.
leaders hopefully will be able to attend truth as seventh graders.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right, yeah. Isaac?
Are there other, of the 11, are there other Montessoris, and is the fact that it is Montessori like, oh, that's complicated, or, oh, that's cool? Do you have any idea?
I think it's more the latter. I think it's cool and it's intriguing, and we would be DC's first Montessori pathway all the way through 12th grade, public Montessori pathway all the way through 12th grade. And I know that the PCSB is very intrigued by that, but because there is not one yet, that also raises some questions around like, what does a Montessori high school look like? And so that's a big part of our model and a big part of our application. There is a very successful, there's a number of very successful public Montessori secondary schools. One is in Cincinnati. It's credited as being the first. It's called Clark Montessori. It's in Cincinnati Public Schools. And I know for a fact, because I connected them yesterday, the PCSB is visiting it next week, at the end of next week. So there's some investment, at least in part we know, in checking out Montessori high schools. And so I do think it's intriguing to them. It seems, I imagine to them like an opportunity to kind of get DC on the map and adding to the literature about what a public Montessori high school, especially an early one, can and should be. But I guess the flip side of that is probably a little bit of trepidation around what it's going to be.
So what's the feeder path? I mean, how would you ensure that our kids will go through Sojourner Truth, since I seem to recall that DCI was the exception, but they weren't going to make another exception for...
Yeah, so DCI, which some of us, a lot of us, I'm sure in the room are aware that there is there's one charter feeder pattern in the city, and it was created by DC Code. So DC Council had to vote to basically approve this one charter feeder pattern. And if you look at the DC Code, it literally says there can be one, and it's made up of these elementary schools with an overlapping programmatic interest in language. Sarah, do you want to kind of speak towards the feeder
Yeah,
issue?
so this is definitely something we're continuing to pursue. So we have been in touch with the charter board about this, with the city council about it. It's something that there's interest in the city, and it seems like people will to push forward. What we're working on is kind of the timing of what that would look like. So we had a decision on whether we wanted to push really hard for right now, but there were some factors that seemed to give us a better shot if we waited for our approval, which still gives us a full year to be able to push through that legislation. So we've been meeting with council members, having the right conversations, and setting ourselves up for it. If we do get a feeder, we're committed to making sure that Truth is a school for all. So the feeder would allow for up to 60% of students from our partner schools to be to have preference in the lottery. So that means we would still be pulling students from other parts of the city, from other schools with Montessori experience as part of our model to make sure that we increase access to Montessori. So we didn't want it to sort of be, only a narrow track for families that start an investment early. But given kind of the projections and the models that Justin has done, there are still going to be quite a few seats available for quite a long time to folks who have invested in the model.
I'm sorry, so that's 60% of the population of the school will be slots for people from feeder schools?
So,
or 60%
right.
of us, our kids, will be able to go to?
Yeah, good question.
Can you just answer?
Oh.
Yeah.
Maybe you repeat the
There's a
question.
thing. I was wondering what this machine was here for. Apparently we're being recorded, so.
Live stream. Live stream.
Live stream.
You're on the World Wide Web.
No pressure. Okay, great. So the question was, does that mean it's 60% of students from our school, from Lee Montessori, or 60% of the student body at Truth?
Right.
So the answer is the latter. So we would look at the number of slots available. So if there are 80 slots available for the 7th grade, we would have 60% of those slots reserved for the feeder schools. And so you would have preference in the lottery as a feeder school up to 60%. And then the other 40% would be open if there is not interest in the other 40% from non-feeder schools. Of course, those seats would have been out to students in feeder schools.
And your executive director, Chris, has been very adamant about wanting to make sure that that number and that 60% does not ever mean that kids are not able to get in. And so he's already pushing talk of if we were to ever get to that point, then what would an expansion of truth look like to make sure that Lee families can always get in. So at least there's an advocate in your corner when it comes to that. So we're in the reverse of our agenda, which is kind of fun. So the Q&A thing is starting us off, which is great. But are there any other kind of pop-in questions? Otherwise, we can start to talk a little bit about going to our mission and our model, and then save some more time at the end for Q&A. But those were all great questions.
Who are all the feeder schools that would be included in the circle?
Yeah, so Lead Montessori, Shining Stars Montessori, Breakthrough Montessori, those would be like the prime feeders. There's been a lot of interest from LAM. So there are a lot of LAM families that are happy with the system they have going into DCI. And then there are a lot of LAM families that really love Montessori and are interested in picking a Montessori route rather than the language route with DCI. And then Capitol Hill Montessori has so Capitol Hill Montessori at Logan, which some of you might be familiar with, is a DCPS Montessori school. They actually go through 8th grade, so they're the one school right now that's a public option for 7th and 8th grade, but they also see attrition because they don't have a high school. So Capitol Hill Montessori at Logan families are very interested in truth from particularly the high school perspective of it. So there's been investment there. And then this would probably not be a legal feeder that could be set up, but Christian Family Montessori, which some of you might be familiar with or have friends that are at as well, they've been big advocates for this and have written letters to the PCSB to try to make this happen as well. That's a good question. All right, so kind of a fun thing that we've done before, and I think a nice way because we are very sort of mission grounded, is to give people, yeah, thank you. I might keep needing reminders of that, by the way. To go back to the mission, and we'll give people a couple of minutes for this, but to read the mission, pick a word, a phrase, or a full sentence if you'd like, that for whatever reason right now resonates with you. So if you've done this before, maybe you'll pick the same thing, you might pick something different. And then we're going to ask you in 2 minutes to share that with a partner. A partner that is not your significant other or spouse.
The people like.
I need footsteps,
Thank you.
Flashbacks to my high school biology teaching days where I would stand right in front of the kids. Okay, so maybe 10 more seconds on this. All right, so why don't you pick a partner or a group of 3 is fine, and then share the word, the phrase, or the sentence that you chose, and maybe give at least a little bit of context for why that particular phrase resonated with you. And then we'll give you a couple minutes for this, and then we might ask for a couple people to share.
Especially especially middle school, high school, I think having a we will tell it who you are.
Tough crowd.
Yeah, in some ways, I feel that's what traditional schools are about.
The other one that
So I don't like it. I always tell them
it's just like
more not.
is that
Okay, we'll do another 30 seconds. So if you haven't switched or if everyone hasn't spoken, let's make sure everyone gets a chance.
I was undecided on that.
All right, would anyone like to either share their personal choice or maybe you thought something was kind of cool that your partner said and you'd like to share that? Yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah, so I think they would know who they are, what they want, and where they're going. And I think that because at such a young age, I think that is very important because I know that when I was 17, I had middle of the street. And I think some people ask me what totality it was. The mission of the school, that's what I went to. Probably not. I mean, I think it can be a kick for me. You know, I was like, you go to school on the track. Yeah. But, yeah, I think that.
Yeah, thank you, and that's a great one. Yeah, I think a lot of school missions now focus on being college and career ready, which is great, but we do want to be much more holistic. And yeah, I appreciate you picking that one up. Thank you. Any others? Did anyone else? I'm just curious. Did anyone else pick that same line? Okay, with fingers pointing. Cool. You know, someone was about to share and said something.
I was struck by the agents in the construction of peace. Forgive the pun. I'm fairly new to Montessori, and I don't claim to get all of it, but one thing that's always struck me is the desire to bring about world peace. And only kindergartner, I'm not seeing how that's coming together yet, but I'm curious to see how that manifests itself.
Yeah, thank you, and I like how you kind of tied it to Montessori because it is a big part of Montessori. And then it also ties directly to our core values, and if we get a chance later tonight, we'll talk a little bit about sort of how that manifests itself and how it's articulated in our core values, and how we're going to make sure that is something that our middle and high schools are dealing with, because conflict does happen quite a bit in middle school, and identity is a big issue with middle school development as well. So those are both things we want to think quite a lot about. So thank you all. So some of you have been to the website. So the website is thetruthschool.org. And so I'm glad you were able to meet Denise this evening, and a lot of you had maybe you didn't know her in the capacity as the board chair for Truth. But we wanted to let you know that the team page on our website has been updated, and so now you can actually go on and see who else is on this founding board. And this thing keeps blinking in and out, but when it goes back in, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who those other board members are. Some of you are aware that we've had a parent design team, we've had an academic design team, we had a culture and climate design team. All of those meetings for the past month or so have kind of been on like a hiatus, but those are going to pick back up later in April. Some of you have emailed in the last month or so to kind of ask and express interest in joining that team. Up to this point, the parent team has been primarily one parent from each of those 3 or 4 schools that were mentioned earlier. And from Lee, Brenna has been involved for the last half year or so. So I have a lot of, I'm very grateful for your contributions, Brenna. So Denise, to give you a little bit of background, Denise is currently in a role as an administrator in DCPS, and at DCPS's second biggest campus, Columbia Heights Education Campus. She has done quite a lot with personalized learning and competency-based learning. Competency-based learning is not something that everyone, particularly outside of sort of the ed world, is familiar with. And so we'll give you a little bit of taste of the competency-based thing later during this presentation. And then those of you that have more questions, I'll be like super happy to hang out after this and talk a little bit more about competency stuff. My background, a lot of you are familiar with already if you've been to any of these sessions, but I was originally a high school science teacher. I taught in Chicago Public Schools for 7 years. I went abroad and taught in Santiago, Chile for 3 years, came to DC and was in DCPS for the last 7 years, and then have been super excited about being full-time on this project for the last 9 or 10 months. Sarah, who is like an IT expert, it looks like,
No, I was
as
just
well.
some guidance from over here. Pull out the plug and put it back in.
Sarah, so my experience with Sarah was when I was an administrator in DC Public Schools. So some of you might know her beyond sort of her capacity as parent at Lee, but she did blink out before for a little while too, and then it came back. So I trust it'll come back in. But Sarah has been a school leader in the, I can pull it back up.
What's the name of the presentation?
So it's under parent info sessions.
Family.
It's probably. But she was a principal at Maya Angelou Public Charter School, which some of you might be aware of. And then she's since moved into an even different position. But when I was in DCPS, she was one of the main sort of decision and policy makers at central office, but also a really sort of fierce and brilliant advocate for a lot of the work that I was doing in innovation and some of what the other schools were doing. Do you want to explain a little bit more maybe about what you do now?
Sure, yeah. So when Justin and I met, I was working on a redesign of our opportunity academies at DC Public Schools. So those are our alternative schools. One of them is actually right around the corner, Luke Seymour. We have 4 of them. And so we were working on how do we bring the deep personalization of learning to an alternative school setting. After I gave Justin a hard time, I think I'm not standing in front of the non-presentation presentation. So I was fortunate to work with our opportunity academies and then also CHEC, where Justin was the assistant principal. They were using the same model. So the Summit model, which started out in California and at a set of charter schools and is now nationwide, is a sort of platform and model and a way to really deeply personalize learning in a competency-based way for students. And so we were bringing it to Opportunity Academies, supporting with the CHEC implementation. And then about a year ago, when lots of stuff happened at DC Public Schools, and there was a pull-out right about graduation, and we had some work to do internally to make sure that we had the right checks and balances in place, I was brought on to that team to figure out what to do next. So we've done some really great work around just kind of the policies and procedures, and but the really exciting part, so in my job, is really the student supports and services. So I oversee the school counseling division, we have a Pathways program for students who are off track, all of our engagement efforts, so just kind of the ways in which we reach students at the secondary level to make sure that they have all the right opportunities to keep them engaged, and then if they kind of get off the path, to bring them on back and re-engage them. So when Justin asked to have a cup of coffee, and I left that cup of coffee agreeing to the board chair, wasn't sure quite what I got myself into, but on a personal note, Sabine and Clementine are my kiddos. They are here. And Sabine had been at another school for a couple of years and was really kind of struggling and every day didn't want to go to school. We transferred her over here. She's had just a tremendous year. And it's been a really big change. So I, like from a personal level, just the excitement of being able to see Montessori all the way through. Like I don't want learning to ever have to stop being hands-on and fun and engaging, and as Sabine says, I love not sitting crisscross applesauce. So I come to it both professionally and personally, and excited to, help with all of our kids.
Yeah, thank you. And then we don't need to do too much in depth on other members, but so Adelie Jacobs and Caroline Hill. Caroline was a founding principal at E.L. Haynes, which some of you might be aware of, so she brings that experience. Caroline and Adelie are both actually also like nationwide workers in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Jonathan O'Connell is one of our board members, so he writes for the Post, and every once in a while you'll see him as kind of a talking head on MSNBC when it comes to economic development in Washington. Ben Williams is the principal over at Ron Brown High School. There was a pretty interesting story on NPR did like a 2-year sort of following of him and his founding of Ron Brown. So he brings a lot of sort of the entrepreneur lens and the founding principal lens of things. Craig Robinson is one of our people that's bringing a lot of finance expertise, which is important in board work for those of you that have done things like that before. Richard Pullman is the executive director over at the Thurgood Marshall Academy, and he was also on the operations side of things when E.L. Haynes expanded to high school. So he's another person. One of the things that we're really trying to put a lot of priority on is this founding experience, because those of you that maybe were involved with the founding of Lee or have been involved with other public charter schools during their first few years know that there's a whole lot of sort of expertise and unique expertise that goes into this founding stage. Kiva is bringing law expertise, but is also a parent over at Shining Stars. Marlena, that name might sound familiar because she is a parent here at Lee. So Marlena is representing Lee from the parent side of things. Wendy Pugh is a parent from Lamb, and so she's been on that team. So Brenna is probably the one in the room right now that recognizes Wendy because they have been on that team together for the last half year or so. And then Lori Fleming is someone who you may see around Lee every once in a while. She works for the National Center for Montessori in the public sector. She was also an administrator at Lamb for quite a while. So she's bringing a whole lot of Montessori expertise to this team. There's 3 main tenets of our model that we want to make sure that people leave kind of understanding how we are rooted in Montessori. So one of the things, even though students are no longer going to be in 6th grade at Lee anymore, where they might be getting multiple 3-hour extended work blocks per day, we are going to maintain at least one extended self-directed work block per day in middle school. And then in high school, they're still going to get that extended self-directed work block, but 2 times a week. So middle schoolers will get 3 hours of this per day, and then high schoolers are going to get 6 total hours per week. So 2 3-hour sessions per week. Meaningful work with real-life application. So again, those of you that have maybe been in the Montessori scene for a long time or are relatively new to it, you already know when your student comes home and is able to do things that go beyond just the Common Core standards. And so while those standards are important, this idea of real-life application is incredibly important too. And then just deliver a designed learning environment. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, and at first, and maybe particularly for people with primary, lower elementary, upper elementary experience, if you're thinking about sort of like the physical space of the classroom, but we also want to think of this as the curriculum and then the social interactions that are happening throughout the day. So these extended self-directed work blocks. Middle schoolers, once again, so for 1 extended session per day, right now we have it scheduled for the afternoon, they're going to be in multi-grade blocks. So they'll be in these mixed age groups with 13 students to a mentor. So they'll have a learning mentor, and then 3 of those sort of mentorship groups will be combined. So there would be 3 adults, close to 40 students in what we're calling a pod. So the teacher, and I kind of call them the mentor, they are going to be more like a learning coach during that time. Student goal setting is going to be a really big part of this. Students coming up with the actual learning plan that they're going to be following and implementing. And then we have a partnership with Dharma Yoga DC, so we're going to have an in-resident Dharma yogi who's going to visit every pod each day to do some physical activity work, but then also some mental stuff, so some meditation and some work on reflection. Any questions about the extended blocks at middle school and high school?
You said that at mixed ages, what stage?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so we are planning right now for the middle school to be grades 7 and 8 for students that are coming in with Montessori experience. So a student from Lee, your students will see Lee through 6th grade, and then Truth, we're hoping would be the landing spot for 7th and 8th grade in middle school, and then high school would start for us in 9th grade. So 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th would be high school. For students that are coming without Montessori experience, we want to have this 6th grade year that can kind of be like an acculturation year. Again, for students that maybe we're not lucky enough to get into Lee or to Shining Stars or Breakthrough, Lamb would also be a place where they would be leaving after 5th grade, because Lamb does not have an upper elementary room that goes through 6th grade. So we would have 6th graders made up of kids from Lamb, and then non-Montessori experienced students, and then again, students from Lee would be coming for 7th and 8th grade for middle school. So middle 6th through 8, high school 9th through 12.
And so each pod will have
6, 7, and 8.
6, 7, and 8. So in the 13 kids, there's going to be kids from.
Yeah, the plan
each
right
one.
now is that the 13 students would cross grade levels. So there's been some discussion, and we've talked about this with like the parent team as well as the academic team, about possibly having those 13, like the advisory group, maybe be single age, so maybe you have like a 6th grade group, a 7th grade group, and an 8th grade group, so that in pod time they're all together, but they can do pullouts and community circles and things like that with students that are their grade level and maybe going through some of the, like we talked about identity formation being a big thing. There might be certain conversations that might be more relevant to 8th graders versus 6th graders. So those are both sort of on the table. It's a good question.
And how big are the classroom going to be for
Yeah.
the kids?
And so facility procurement is like, I was about to say priority 1, but I feel like there's like 10 priority upon approval, but facilities procurement is a really big one. And so we've already been visiting different facilities. And there's so many even priorities with facilities. We would love to have a lot of green space, so we're going to talk about how a farm, an on-campus farm is ideal. We also would like to have classrooms and a lot of flexible space. So we would love to be in a situation where there is almost like WeWork style space for 40 kids to be together with different sorts of physical space for collaboration versus individual work versus maybe small group targeted workshops or something. But it could also be a situation where a pod might be 2 rooms, 2 separate classrooms that are connected or something like that. And students are free to sort of go from one room to another because they're in that pod. So to some degree, we'll be working with what's available. So there's sort of the pie in the sky image of what the layout would be, and then there's what's available. And particularly in probably years 1 and 2, we might need to be more on the what's available side while we build out the full school. Was there follow-up that?
Yes, and then I was wondering, okay, so 3 hours in blocks, and then what?
Yeah, good question. So in the mornings, there's going to be 3 content sessions. So we do want to get them used to in high school. They're going to be going to even more content sessions per day. In middle school, there would be 3 content sessions per morning. So about an hour long where they would go to humanities, which would be sort of a blend of what a typical DCPS student might have for like ELA and then social studies. So we're going to do those 2 things together. So we'll do a lot of ELA skill building in the context of historical texts and things like that. And then there's going to be a STEM class, which again is going to be a mix of math and then science, and have some flexibility to kind of like go between the 2, but to ensure that we can get through a fairly structured math scope and sequence over the course of the year, because those are becoming higher priorities as we're trying to get kids ready to have this holistic experience, but also when it comes down to it, we want a rigorous curriculum that they've experienced by the time they're graduating high school. Yeah, so in the morning they would go from humanities to STEM to an elective in some way. Yeah,
Sounds like what you're describing sounds awesome. I'm from Cleveland, so my educational experience was very different.
Yeah.
There's also this huge pressure to teach the test, and I assume that your people will have to do that to some extent, and so that sounds jarring, like the 2 things existing in the same
and it's a
place.
really good question. And we're kind of proud to be able to say that we don't think it's as jarring as it might seem. There's a lot of evidence that shows that the curriculum which we're proposing and sort of the ownership that's built and the investment that's built should leave us pretty confident that our students are going to perform just fine and maybe even extremely well when it comes to something in the park. So I, at my last school, shifted, and Sarah kind of alluded to this, shifted to a more personalized experience where kids were starting to get an hour per day where they could set up goals, and sort of this student might be working on math and this student might be working on a history project or something. And a lot of teachers were nervous about, wait a minute, that means 10 minutes less of math per day. And over the course of 3 years, they have quadrupled the number of students achieving at level 4 or 5 in Park, which are the 2 highest levels. So even with the less sort of structured, sort of teacher-centered math stuff that they're getting exposed to, the math scores have increased significantly.
That's great.
Yeah. And then also it's worth saying, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about this, the concept of competency-based learning and the truth competency framework that we have, but it's all directly aligned to the Common Core, and so there should not be fear around this idea that, wait a minute, if my student's at truth and they're doing all this stuff that sounds kind of cool and fun, but are they actually going to still be getting a rigorous, the same experience or being exposed to the same sort of rigor that a student might be at a more traditional place? Brenna, do you want to?
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about in the parent design team with this isn't just like totally free goal setting and plan formation. They're taking what they've learned in those content blocks and then deepening it with their projects and with their student-led learning. So if, Kellen is struggling with a math concept that they had that morning, he can then sit down with his mentor that afternoon and say, you know what, I really just want to spend an hour working on practicing this math concept. And then I'm going to spend an hour working on an essay or a history project, and then, or however else, I'm going to work with so-and-so. So it's not whatever I want to do this afternoon. They're starting kind of like, so in elementary, they have the lessons, and then they have to plan out through the week how they're going to apply and deepen those lessons. This is the same thing, just a little bit more structured than it currently is in the elementary class.
That was a nice explanation. Thank you. So we talked about number 2 being this idea of meaningful work with real life application, and this actually also kind of gets to Isaac's point and sort of the response I was attempting to give, and this idea that a lot of the time that's spent in maybe a more traditional classroom, the learning is very passive, the engagement level is not always maybe as high as the teacher or the school would like. And there are a lot of students asking these questions about like, well, why are we doing persuasive writing, or why am I learning about quadratic functions? And this idea of, and this is a Montessori principle, of giving kids direct exposure to the applications for all of these things on a regular basis. So things are not just handouts, and you're not just writing an essay for the teacher, but you're actually trying to create an argument because we're inviting a DC council member in, and you're going to get the chance to really pitch why you want to make this change, or why you think she or he should vote a particular way. Maria Montessori wrote a lot about this concept of a nerdkinder, and this idea that students, as they move into adolescence and as they leave Lee, are going to be going through all of these changes, sort of chemically and physically, and also mentally, and that they should be given an opportunity to work a lot of those things out without sort of constant infringement from adults. And so this is providing both academic space, but also some space for those of you who, and there were a couple conversations I had as parents were walking in and sort of wistfully looking out the playground and talking about how much your kids love the time that they get outside and out of the classroom. This is structured time, but it's also time out of the classroom. Again, where students are able to see the direct application of the chemistry that they're doing when they're looking at soil science and things like that. So once per week during that 3-hour block, the plan right now is for kids to engage directly with what we're calling an enterprise. So one enterprise might be the farm. And then the idea being that kids would, on a weekly basis or at least a monthly basis, bring some products to market, and that we would be able to engage in a farmer's market. And not necessarily an on-campus farmer's market, but a public market. And so the idea being that this would be an on-campus or an on-site enterprise, but public-facing, so have this public-facing component. There's a term in Montessori lingo called valorization, and this idea that it sort of valorizes a student to be able to know that, oh wow, there's real money exchanging hands here, and there were real consequences to what I did. And if you drop the ball, there's negative consequences, or if you do great work, there could be some very positive consequences. But that's different than just, you know, getting an 8 out of 10 on a handout and then getting something back from your teacher that says you have a B. An apiary, who knows what an apiary is? This is like a crossword word or something, I feel. Yeah, so bees, so that's something that there's some excitement around. You guys are lucky enough to, your kids get experience with your chicken coop. But things like a bike maintenance shop would be possible. So again, something where, yeah, people from the public would be able to come in and maybe get their bikes tuned up by our students. Any questions about this concept? At the high school level, this would transition a little bit. So in 9th and 10th grade, on a regular basis, we would be shifting to slightly more employability skills, so that in 11th and 12th grade, during those 2 sort of 3-hour blocks per week, kids would get off campus and then be in professional internships that are somehow aligned to their interests. So if they have specific career interests, that's great. If like a lot of us, maybe it's an 11th grader that doesn't quite know what they want to do yet, so that's part of our job at Truth, is to give them some exposure and to help them try to figure that out. So deliberate design of the learning environment, we talked about the physical space, or the way that desks are arranged and the way that kids sit. So we want to be sort of creative but deliberate or intentional about the actual physical space. Also the sort of the social interactions that kids have. Those of you who are in the education world have maybe heard more and more talk about social emotional learning, or SEL, lately, and one of the really kind of wonderful things about Montessori is that all of this has always been built in. So for the past 100 years, Montessori has been supportive of social emotional learning. Specifically, there's sort of a collaboration that's nationally known for a lot of research and work around SEL, and there's 5 main pillars. So this idea of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, positive or healthy relationships, and then responsible decision making. So as you look at those things, those are extremely important. And a lot of the emphasis that's being put on SEL right now is coming out of the fact that there are a lot of schools who focus primarily on the academic angle, and then they're experiencing kids that are going to college and then are no longer necessarily successful because the student doesn't know how to self-manage or set goals and pivot with their learning plan when things don't pan out perfectly. As far as being very deliberate and careful about our academic approach, this is where this idea of competency-based learning comes in, and where we're not picking an arbitrary or seemingly arbitrary number like a 7 out of 10 on a quiz and saying like, oh, that's a C, and a C is kind of like pretty good. It's between an A and failing. So I got 8 out of 10 right, I got a B. But really focusing in on the skills. And so for the next probably 5 minutes or so, we're going to get into some of the curriculum stuff, and this is largely because I know a few of you talked to Megan and were excited about hearing more curriculum. I'll probably go kind of shallow, and then those of you that are interested in this can either hang out afterwards and we could talk a little bit more and I could do more in depth. But I could probably easily go on very long with curriculum stuff, and I'll try to be sensitive to that. So the idea of a competency framework, these are sort of the core parts of it. So you have a single framework which is going to apply to kids whether they're in 7th or 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, all the way through high school. So a student will get familiar with this idea that when she or he reads a text, there is a competency around determining the central idea or the theme of the text. So that's a competency. And there's a version that would be suitable for an 8-year-old, and then there's a version of that that's more suitable for like an 18-year-old. But that is going to be a competency as the student moves through truth. So then there are these vertically aligned bands where we can say, well, what does it mean to be able to determine the central idea of the text? What does it mean for an 11-year-old, and then what does it mean for a 17-year-old? And the idea here is that this then takes the focus away from we're all in maybe a 7th grade room together, so we're going to do stuff that 7th graders are supposed to do, And then it puts the focus on, well, Sarah is at this particular level when it comes to determining the central idea of the text. Justin is a little bit behind, he's at this other level. So what does Sarah need to get to the next level? What does Justin need to get to his next level? So it allows for much more targeted instruction and much more personalized instruction. And again, it takes away some of like what we've all experienced, which when you think about it was a little bit arbitrary, why 60% should be a D and like a 59% an F. And it puts the emphasis way more on the skills that students need to be successful. And it very much allows for a student who might be behind grade level, quote unquote grade level in a certain thing, to be in the same classroom as a student who might be 4 years above grade level. And to really be able to focus on, well, what does the student that's above grade level need to get even further? And then what does the student who maybe is behind grade level need to catch up? And then all of these competencies that we've developed have been directly fed by Common Core standards. And so we do have a lot of these academic competencies, like I mentioned, this idea of determining the central idea of a text. And then we can also have core value competencies. And a lot of these align really well with the social emotional learning tenets that we spoke of before. But Truth's four core values are designing for positive impact, honoring self-development, pursuing justice everywhere, and challenging the mind, body, and soul. And we've done work with that parent design team, with other design teams as well, to articulate, well, what does, just like we want to know what determining central idea of a text meant, what does designing for positive impact mean for a typical 11-year-old versus an 18-year-old? And what do we want students to leave truth being able to do when it comes to honoring self-development? Any questions around this?
Does it mean you want to have grades?
That's a great question. It means that our grades will align more to sort of competency expectations. So maybe we'll say that a B, because it is important, and again, I think I kind of touched on this before. I do think it's very important that when students leave truth in the 12th grade or when they're applying for universities and things, that universities are able to look at a transcript or a report card and make sense out of it. And it's worth mentioning there are a whole lot more schools and districts across the country moving towards competency-based learning, but still I think people are used to seeing, oh, my student has an A, that's great, or they have a C, I want them to get it up to a B or an A. And so it's likely that being sort of at the expected level would be a B, and then for students that are slightly above would be an A range, if you're slightly below would be a C, and then significantly below would be a B. So they will translate, yeah. But that said, this will allow report cards to be way more specific. And a lot of you with elementary, in fact, I don't know what a lead, I need to investigate what a lead report card looks like. But
It's a paragraph.
oh, it's the narrative, yes. You
Yeah,
guys
so
wrote
it's
the narrative,
it's a paragraph
yeah.
at the beginning of kind of like an overview of how your kid's doing in the class. And then it goes into what's specific, then it breaks it out into like math or STEM, I can't remember it. We haven't seen it for this, but it goes into like math, and then it's specific skills
Yeah.
and whether they've mastered it, whether they're still learning it, haven't mastered it, or haven't been taught it. And so the report card is like 4 pages long, and then there's a small couple sentences at each kind of academic bucket. So I'll get kind of an overview of how Kellen is doing in math, and then I can
Like the
exactly
specific
see
stuff,
and see
skills, yeah.
exactly how he's doing in long division and multiplication and that kind of thing. And same thing with English
And so what we'll likely have is a system where you would be able to see, oh, if we're talking middle school, in STEM, my student has an A minus. In high school, in geometry, my student has a B plus or whatever. But then also be able to show the specific competencies and say, okay, your student is right here, this is what they need to get to the next level. So when they are making an argument, your student right now is able to make claims to support that argument. If she wants to get to the next level, she's going to have to learn about presenting counterclaims as well as claims. And then that becomes something that either you can coach the student with, or at least you're aware that this is the coaching that student is getting.
And one more thing to add that's exciting. A couple years ago in DC, there was a regulation passed that allows for competency-based education. It's a seat hour waiver provision. So basically the regular Carnegie unit, for those who are familiar with secondary education, it's 120 hours per course. So it's based on seat time. but a lot of districts, including DC, have moved away. So that is still the standard way that credits are awarded in the district, but charter schools and DCPS schools can apply for a waiver and basically say, instead of awarding a credit upon sitting for 120 hours, we plan to award a credit upon the attainment of these competencies. And so that would allow for students at Truth to move through courses at their own pace. So if they are able to get through kind of the standard courses to continue to take more, that will set them up for success.
Yeah, there's all these things I think we sometimes don't think about, but why should a student necessarily have to sit through 120 hours of geometry if they can already show that they've
So
mastered
it's kind of like
geometry?
an
We should be able to
agent
challenge that
test, like you
student
get
with
credit for
something
the
different.
knowledge.
I'll speak briefly about some like specific curriculum, but if you would like to see more, so there's a little tiny URL up there, and I'll share this presentation with everybody so that you have access to it. But tinyurl.com and then sample truth units, and then you can see a bunch of the different units that we've built out. So there are scopes and sequences for courses, which implies sort of over a 40-week year. These are the main topics that are good for your students to be exposed to. So if you're wondering like what is going to happen in 7th grade humanities and what are they going to be reading in 8th grade humanities and 9th grade ELA, those are things that you can start to look at. And then each of our units is typically going to be 5 weeks long. You can look at some sample unit plans and then also sample lesson plans. So what like a lesson inside of that unit plan would look like. If you are curious about sort of being in what might be considered a progressive school or something like that, and this humanities thing rather than ELA and social studies, and again, you're curious about, is my student, are they not going to learn about the Civil War? Is my student going to go through truth and never learn about mitosis and meiosis in life sciences or something like that? We are drawing from sort of generally accepted scopes and sequences, and we're just being creative about the way that those things are being, the touches that your student will get. We're getting a lot of resources drawn from research-supported things that, again, if you're in the education world, maybe you've heard of things like illustrative math or Common Lit.
Question.
Yeah.
What is the freedom that both the teachers and the students will have as far as choosing their own paths or teams?
Yeah, and what I'll do, I'm gonna fast forward here to this idea of like a deep dive learning cycle. And so students at any given time are gonna be engaged in a project in one of their courses. So there's a clear, and I wonder if I put it in here. Yeah, so like the first 5 weeks of school, STEM classes are gonna be in the deep dive. So your 7th grader would be in a project for 5 weeks in their STEM class, and they would not be responsible for a project during that 5 weeks of humanities. So they're still doing humanities stuff, but there's not a big project that's being done there. And then the next 5 weeks it flips. So they're always able to focus on one, and they're not like overwhelmed with having to do multiple projects at once. Each project, and this is another research-based approach, and this is something to think about when you're, regardless of what your career is or what you do in life, when you get a new assignment or if you're given a task, whether it's by your boss or you want to create something, there are, research shows that there's sort of like 4 typical steps that you go through, 4 processes. So this idea of like making meaning of it. So when we were engaging in this process of creating a charter, one of the first things we did is we looked at what other charter applications are out there and what do they look like. So who got accepted 2 years ago? Who did not get accepted and why? So start to like look at the genre of work that you are engaging in. So if you're a lawyer, if you're an artist, regardless of what you are, you sort of explore the genre of the assignment, and then you start to come up with criteria for what is a good version of X, and then what are maybe some not as good versions. So you start to sort of, again, create this criteria for excellence. That's a big part of the first part. And then you start to actually investigate and you figure out, well, if I'm a chef, well, what is my version of this going to be like? If you're a lawyer and you're making an argument, well, what sources can I draw from to support my claim? Then you eventually start to create, which involves lots of revision. So it's not like you just write an essay and then you're done with it, but you get feedback on it, you sort of compare it to the criteria that you originally came up with. So this is an iterative process, just like real life involves iterative processes. and then eventually you are somehow presenting that product. And so the authenticity of this presentation is something that we really want to preserve that truth as well. So students are not just going to be presenting projects to their teacher or to their classmates, but before we were talking about like trying to persuade a council member to vote a certain way. So at the very least, we would be talking about a letter there that's going to go to a council member. Possibly we're going to invite the council member. If that's not working, maybe we're going to go to a council member's office until someone's going to listen to that student. When it comes to an actual project, so there might be a unit on argumentative essay writing, and so there might be some specific competencies that are involved there, so developing a thesis, finding support, relevant evidence to support your argument, those will all be competencies. And there would likely be a theme under which the student would be expected to work under, so like community might be the theme, and they're supposed to come up with an argument about maybe like an injustice in the community, and then how they think it could be remedied. And then that becomes sort of the parameters with a whole sort of world of choice within those parameters. So that was maybe a circuitous way, but to bring it back to the question, that allows a situation where you've got a group of 20 students who are working on the common skill of presenting an argument and presenting claims and supporting those claims, and maybe structuring their argument, but everybody's arguments can be tied to their personal passions or interests. So we're not all writing arguments about whether the Washington football team should change its name. Maybe somebody wants to do that because they're passionate about football, or they're passionate about, they see that as racist or not racist, and they want to. Any other questions about that? This is an example, just so you can get an idea of like a competency and what a band sort of looks like. There would be levels, this is kind of an excerpted version. There would be a 7th grade, 9th grade, 11th grade as well. And it would probably also go lower in this direction because we're assuming we're going to get some students that are below grade level, and then it would go higher in this direction. Because if a student is already at 12th grade, we don't want to just be happy that they're there, we want to push them even further. So the competency here is this idea of using evidence, and then the skill would be determining relevance in sources. So looking at different sources and determining whether those sources are relevant for maybe your thesis. So in the 6th grade, we're looking at students to be able to choose relevant information from different formats, from sources that are provided, gather information with which to approach the research question. Whereas by the time that student is leading truth, we want them to be able to choose varied sources that give credible, relevant information, allowing for a comprehensive context by which to approach the research question at a complex level, appropriate for the purpose of the research and for the audience. So there's a whole lot there to kind of unpack, but this is much more challenging. And then there's a whole spectrum or a continuum of sort of, well, what do I need to do to get to the next level, to then get to here, to eventually be here. And then regardless of where you are on there, it's cool, that's fine. We want to get you to the next level.
For those that are past
Yeah.
grade 12, and in light of rising college tuition costs, will AP classes be an option?
Yeah. So right now we are planning on offering as soon as AP classes, likely starting in 11th grade, maybe as soon as 10th grade, but likely 11th. Yes. And if you look at when I send sort of a follow-up email to everybody that includes this presentation, I'll include a link to the charter application, and in section B, which is like page 100, whatever, there is a proposed course listing, and you would be able to, it is a 710-page document, the whole document, but there's a course listing of proposed courses for high school that you'd be able to check out, yeah.
What about
It's a good question. We haven't talked much about homework, but I could tell you that, I mean, my policy personally would not be necessarily based on like, oh, kids should have X amount of homework per night, but again, based it on sort of skills and where we're going and project completion. And in some cases, that's, if you're behind in a project, you are going to have to find time to make it up. And if a student can be extremely maybe focused during their extended self-directed work block, that student might need to go home without any homework that day. Okay, so where we are in any of that stuff that we just talked about, whether it was that deep dive thing or like diving into a particular unit, anybody who wants to hang out afterwards, we could talk about that.
Oh,
But I
wait.
do want to kind of, yeah, go
Can I
ahead.
ask one more question?
Of course, yeah.
Piggybacking off the AP one, sorry,
Yeah.
slow to catch up. Will there be, is there any thought about having like a relationship with a community college or like UBC to be able to take, if you want beyond the AP courses, like actually start taking kind of yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And we haven't, this is where sort of one of the many places where Sarah has been able to be like hugely helpful with making connections. So she connected me to someone at UDC, and originally the conversation was entirely around them because they have this great sustainable farming program, and it was originally the conversation started around that and how they could support our enterprise program. And by the way, so they were talking about how they have a 40-acre farm in Maryland that they would be welcome to, or we would be welcome to sort of work out a lease where we could have an acre of it. And they do a farmer's market in Northeast on a weekly basis, I guess. And they're like, oh yeah, you could have a table at the farmer's market. And it became a very cool conversation. They had a commercial like cannery and all this, like a commercial kitchen that they train people in at the college level. And they were like, yeah, when you are teaching students about if you want to come in and reserve it for canning, then that's more stuff that you could bring to market. But it became a much wider conversation about opportunities like dual enrollment and how kids in truth might be able to then either at one level maybe audit, but even maybe get college credit for some courses over there. Yeah, that's a great question. So where we are in this whole process. So for those of you that were here early on, a little under 2 weeks ago, we officially submitted our charter to the Public Charter School Board. We have a capacity interview tomorrow. So they do one of what they call a capacity interview, where we can bring a team of people. And so we have a team of 5 or 6 of us that are gonna have an interview tomorrow where they'll ask questions of either things that they see as question marks still after having read the 710 pages, or they want to probe on a certain thing about the competency framework or something like that. And then the public hearing on Monday, April 22nd. So those are kind of the 2 touch points that we have with the PCSB before they make their final determination on May 20th. We are feeling good about going into this capacity interview. One area, the 2 areas where like people in this room could still, I think, make a big difference would one be being present at the public hearing. It would be wonderful to have as many people as possible. Again, wearing our truth t-shirts and kind of showing solidarity around wanting to make this happen, because the need and demand are 2 things that they take very seriously. And we have a great argument for the need for this. There is no public option right now through 12th grade. There's data from other public Montessori secondary options in other cities that are doing wonderful things, and kids are leaving not only with this holistic education, but also even outperforming other schools with sort of the traditional metrics like PAR. So we have a strong argument for the need. We were able to submit about 150 parent letters of support with our charter application, which is great. But again, the more we can show that there are a lot of parents that want to make this happen, the more likely the members are to approve. So being there on Monday, the 22nd is wonderful. If you can't be there, whether you wrote a letter or didn't write a letter, you are free to drop an email here at public.comment@dcpcsb.org. A 1-sentence thing: I'm a parent of a Montessori student at Lee, and I really want truth to happen. I went to an info session. I'm excited for truth. It could be 1 sentence, and again, click send, and it'll be a positive in our corner. Other things, we're going to continue to lobby with the DC Council. Sarah mentioned that earlier, for the creation of an official feeder pattern. DCPS, which some of you who have been to info sessions prior to this have heard me talk a little bit about DCPS, but DCPS has also shown interest. So we have some meetings with DCPS Central Office coming up in the next month. If we were to be a DCPS school, that actually makes the feeder pattern a whole lot easier, because they can do a preference. And they could do a preference that could include charter schools as well. So that is still on the table. And then later in April, design team work or design committee work is going to pick back up. And so if you might be interested in joining that academic team, that parent team, the culture and climate team, being in touch with you would be wonderful. And we usually meet with those teams like once every 2 weeks.
So does the proposal assume that the feeder pattern is gonna happen, or is it just independent of feeder?
We propose the feeder pattern in a few different places because we want to be really clear in the application that this is something that we are pursuing, this is something that we want. So in that sense, yes, but we also don't necessarily want the PCSB to think that success is predicated on a feeder pattern, because that then sort of gives them the window to say, well, if there's no feeder pattern, we're not going to approve it. And then, because we're hearing similar things from the DC Council of like, well, you don't have a school yet, so you're kind of getting ahead of yourself with legislation. So it's a kind of a balancing act. So we're trying to do both now, but which one comes first? I mean, we'll get whichever one first that we can get, but that was, we were very intentional about making it clear in the charter that we are pursuing.
I'm sorry, I don't know the law, but would it be possible to do it by application, like, school without walls?
That's because it's DCPS. So DCPS has the authority to do that, so we can, DCPS can establish preferences, we can have entrance exams for our selective high schools, but there's no regulation or code that allows for charter schools to do that.
Oh,
The only exception is DCI, which was that one-time exception that was written into code.
Okay.
And so we're pursuing the same type of exception, just basic, if it's a charter school.
Like
it would be
literally changing it from one exception
to two exceptions.
And there are DC, it should be mentioned, there are DC council members that are strong advocates for us and that want this to happen.
Can you share which ones they are, just so we?
So Councilmember Grasso in particular is a big champion of it, which is wonderful. And Councilmember Mendelson is warm to it as well.
That's helpful.
What's that?
That's helpful.
Yeah, right. And he, for good reason, I think, and generally likes to be transparent, and so he wants things to go public. The DCI thing was kind of snuck in on a budget support act. Nothing to do with education, but they kind of slipped in this like, oh yeah, we're going to create a feeder pattern for a whole charter school. Mendelson wants to make sure that if this goes in, whether it's on a budget support act or whatever, that there are public hearings around it. So, yeah. Yeah. Add a question or comment?
I'm just interested how, what is one, how much of the other applications do you know, or do you have any sense of how much they're actually actively engaging in, essentially the lobbying campaign that you described here, and two, how much do we have to do to distinguish ourselves? Like, we could sit outside at the table and make every parent who comes in send a public comment.
Yeah.
What,
computer set up.
right, but what's appropriate? Like, what, will they be like, wow, that's a lot, hold on, like, or?
It's a really good question. The first part, you asked the question around, are there other applicants that are seeking a feeder pattern?
No, that are just engaged in this sort of aggressive, like,
Oh,
really
I see what you're
actively
saying.
trying to push our.
I think that all of them are, to be
Okay.
honest with you.
Great, yeah,
I
that's
think
good.
that we have an advantage over them because we have this built-in, baked-in group of stakeholders. I mean, the other schools don't have schools that don't have, with hundreds of kids who are hoping to be able to feed into them. So they are going around to community centers and churches and trying to, talk about their model and hope that they can get 5 or 10 people to write a letter. Whereas we were able to, like you're saying, stand by the front door and get 150 letters written. So I think we probably have more. I hope we have more support, public support than some of these other schools, but I would like it to be as overwhelming as possible. I would like them to get annoyed with how many emails they're opening and saying like we want to.
I'll tell you that among just parents that aren't even in Montessori, like my son does junior waves in Tacoma, and I'll introduce myself, and they're like, "Oh, Montessori, do you know anything about the Montessori middle and high school?" And I haven't heard that kind of question. I haven't heard anybody talk about any other new school that is at the time.
You can read all the applications, they're all up online too, and I would say the quality of, you can tell by the quality of the application which one's possibly could rise.
Yeah, and I appreciate that sentiment. And there are, and some of the other models are interesting. And some of the, yeah, so we are familiar with some of the other people that are applying, and some of them have some kind of cool models, but I agree with you, Susan.
And just for the record, when Justin submitted the 710-page application, I believe he was A, the first one to submit, and B, it was absolutely complete. They thought that there was one thing missing, but there wasn't even one thing missing, it was in there, so.
I was waiting outside the PCSB office that morning.
With
I thought everybody would be like that. Yeah.
So how much blood did you shed when you dropped off your application? Because
Not as much as,
not as much as Meg.
Yeah, that was, I could not get that story out of my head. Right? Yeah.
I think you have a question over here, Justin.
Can you say more about
Yeah.
the partnership with DCPS? What would that look like?
So-
What would be beneficial there?
Yeah, and I'll try to give a little bit of context without like taking up too much time with it.
I didn't get the whole question.
Yeah, so the question is for a little bit more information around what this could look like if DCPS were to show even more interest and maybe make an offer or something like that, and what would that mean for the school model and everything? Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the context behind this is that there is an Office of Innovation in DCPS, and they used to come out, and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the leader of that particular office and the chancellor, back when Antoine Wilson was the chancellor, he came out and visited Lee and was impressed by Lee and was sort of like, oh, I wish there was a middle high school. And Chris was sort of like, well, the good news is we've got the ball rolling on middle high school. And then he was no longer the chancellor. But the Office of Innovation was still having conversations with Chris and then eventually having conversations with me. And now we're sort of 2 chancellors removed from that. And so it's been a little bit rocky in sort of the continuity. But the current chancellor, so if you've read anything about Farabee, he has a history of liking sort of bold models and interesting partnerships and bringing some schools from the charter sector into Indianapolis Public Schools when he was there. And he's in a tricky situation now because he got some criticism, I think, from that when he entered DCPS, because the DCPS world was worried that he might be too charter friendly. And so it's unclear where he will necessarily fall, but he has made it clear that he wants new bold models in DCPS. So if they were to hear our model and maybe read what we're proposing in the charter and be willing to say that you have amnesty from the DCPS curriculum and you have amnesty from maybe if we didn't want to do the same teacher evaluation system or something. If we had autonomy to come up with our own teacher evaluation system, but we were able to take advantage of DCPS facilities and some other blocking and tackling that like DCPS can do, and rely on DCPS central office and all of the supports that come with that, then it arguably could put us in a better position than being in the charter sector. So we would want amnesty to really be able to be true to our model. But if that were the case, then we would be listening.
So those conversations are there and potentially.
Yeah, those conversations are there. I don't want to put too much.
Yeah.
If I, yeah, so the couple things I'll add are, first of all, you got a precedent that was just set last year when DCPS did take over a charter school, which is Excel Academy in Anacostia. You've got Ellington, which is a school that has an independent board of directors that oversees it and allows for a lot of the same flexibility and things like that in their model. It's a good question if somebody else asked about like a application school like that. There's that. Within DCPS, there's just a ton more legal flexibility to do a bunch of different things as long as there's basically a commitment to make it start. Once it's in there, it's really hard for them to make major changes.
And actually, BARD is the better example. We're doing BARD Early College, and so that's basically being run by another school, but it's
Yeah, it is, yes, and most charters are bound to this performance management framework that is heavily based on park scores, for better or for worse. And every 5 years, if you are not meeting the expectations on that, then you are at risk of losing your charter. Whereas DCPS schools, if there's community support and if the chancellor is supportive of it, are not under the same sort of 5-year cycle of is this school going to be able to continue existing. So there are advantages and sort of pluses and minuses both ways, but that's a really good question. I think everybody, well, a lot of you probably do have my contact info, but if you don't, it's up here, and then I'll make sure that it's also still there when I send this out to everyone. But we will kind of open things up to, or back up to a general Q&A. It's 7:20, and I know that we originally said this was going to, be, this part would be over around 7, so don't feel bad if you do have any commitments or need to kind of shuffle in different directions, but I will definitely stay as long as people have questions or want to talk about it. So thank you all again for being here.
I asked a lot of questions already.
No, that's great.
Will you send out prep notes or something for what you want people to, whatever's most useful in the meeting on the 22nd?
Yeah, and that's even a good opportunity. So what we've heard is that it will be really powerful if we have a strong showing of people, but that they might frown on having 40 people come to the microphone. So yeah, so I think Sarah and I and Denise will probably do some strategizing around, do we want 3 parents and 2 board members and 1 student or something like that. And some of you have already expressed willingness. It's been overwhelming how many of you actually have expressed willingness to come to the mic and make a public comment, which we're super appreciative of. And so we'll reach out to those people and sort of let you all know where we're falling and who we're going to sort of ask to step up in that situation. And when we do, we'll do a lot of prep about like what we want to make sure we're on the side. But thank you for that question.
And I know Justin mentioned this, but you do get a t-shirt.
Yeah.
It's really soft and really nice, a great color palette. You can see I almost
The
wear one
logo's
just
great.
to kind of entice people.
Yeah.
But we want to show up, wearing our gear and being truth strong.
Do
If the hearing is appropriate to bring students, how long is it going to be?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. The length question is tough. So it's going to start, they finally said it's going to start at 6:30 on April 22nd. They're having to do it over 2 days because there's so many schools applying this year. So we are on the 22nd. They are going to tell us what the order will be. So we'll know whether it's probably going to be 7 o'clock for us, probably going to be 8 o'clock for us. I'm going to be honest, apparently last year, it went until like after midnight. Yeah, so my fingers are crossed that it will be the first or second one, and then we'll be on at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock. It would be wonderful to have students there, but we are also arranging childcare here, and no one, PCSB included, is going to expect 100 people to be there at like 1 a.m. or something. I think we will be noticed, especially with the t-shirts. I think we'll be noticed at 7 o'clock, even if you are out of there at a reasonable hour.
Are you getting king-size t-shirts too?
Yeah.
Guess what they're gonna say? Future students.
For the council members and the feeder pattern, are there council members that would be helpful for us to email or call support?
Good question. Let me get back to you. So I'll speak, and there are some of the, again, in Mendelssohn's office and Gross's office, they have education people who have been very helpful, and so those might be good people to like loop in with and figure out who the right people that might be on the fence that we need to do some convincing. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Like, for example, that I know that there are some of you that like work with these people, interact with them socially, cut their hair. So like if you're interacting with any of them, just like make sure that you're speaking positively about how excited you are about things like this.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. thank you everybody again. We might still have some food back there, I don't know, but,
Thank you.
we appreciate your time.
Okay.
Yeah, what do I do,
We have to
just
take
stop?
it back too.